So then, we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yirmiyahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yirmiyahu the prophet, on chapter 18, we find then the great prophet explaining of the area, or then the land of Cush, where the first holy city of the restoration period is going to be at, so as then the first holy city of the time of Yohanan was at. Prophet Yirmiyahu was considered as a crazy person. He was not a normal person of his time, and very cautiously the people of the law had taken note of his prophecies. But truly Yirmiyahu the prophet was a person that was cast aside during his time of service. As we read today Yirmiyahu the prophet, we think ourselves what a great prophet this person was. But if we were there during the time of his duty, he was absolutely ostracized, and he was obviously put to death. He was sawn in half, and he was destroyed. Reading from the Holy Instructions is always inspirational, because the more we read, the more we understand. And there is a situation regarding the instructions, and these are not mystical. Let's, for example, understand the story of Moses. Moses, as we understand, he was placed on the river Nile because of the order of a Pharaoh, and they were destroying the firstborn male. And the mother of Moses then, because she feared the mighty Creator, the heavens and the earth, and she was then obviously afraid of destroying the child, and she decided to build up a basket, and she had obviously taken him to the river, and he was then placed on the river, and the river had taken him down. And then the daughter of Pharaoh, she was bathing at the river as usual. It was a normal day. And back then they had servants and maids, and they saw this basket, and then they saw there was a child in the basket, and then the daughter of Pharaoh gave the order to take the child, and by some miraculous act of the Almighty, she told her mate, and her mate was the very mother of the child, and she told her to nurse the child for her, and therefore it was the greatest understanding as far as the early life of Moses. And then when he grown up, he then began his quest of understanding the importance of his people. Yet he was pondering his place in history, because somehow he felt that he belonged to those slaves. The Hebrews were slaves for a long time. Roughly 400 years they were slaves in Egypt. And for some reason Moses had a link with these people. There was a day, there was then an Egyptian in charge of some Hebrews, and then for some reason they were fighting, and Moses saw it and he tried to intervene, and there was an Egyptian guard that was involved with it. And during this time of brawl, Moses then went forth and he struck down the guard and he died. So the leadership of Moses was then starting to show itself by his actions, though he was a murderer because he murdered the guard. Yet then the Hebrews did not recognize him as a person with a great potential of being the leader. Later on, there were Hebrews mistreating each other, and Moses then tried to intervene again. And the Hebrews then, at least one of them, had mentioned then if he was going to destroy them as he destroyed the guard, or the Egyptian guard. And certainly then Moses was afraid. And he fled for his life, and he left Egypt. And he left his position, what he had. And for many years, he stayed in the desert. Then, Jethro was then a person very influential in the life of Moses, and he obviously had a family of himself. And he was in the desert for a long time. 40 years he was then in the desert tending animals and flocks. However, Moses was not a person regarded as a competent shepherd. He was simply doing his duty because he found himself in a place he had no choice. But he wasn't a great shepherd. The animals, they tried to get away from him as much as they could. And there was a day when the mighty Creator decided it was the time for his people to get out of Egypt. And Moses was doing what was usual. He was there in the desert and he was involved with the herds. And as usual, the herds, they tried to get away from Moses than otherwise. And then an animal of his flock went out. So then we understand facts of the Torah and the prophets and the writings, and not whatsoever we read. Not every portion of the Torah is 100% truth. Because of oral traditions, and these oral traditions were then spoken generation by generation by generation, there was always a tendency of inflating the situation more than they should have. In other words, each person who was involved speaking of these oral traditions, they had to invent something more to becoming more interesting. So try to understand then the steps of formation, so then we can understand the story of Moses. Until these oral traditions were recorded, each person then saying the story, they were placing more in these history than they should have. Some examples. Let's say Moses then is a person, and then Daniel. Daniel was also a very important prophet. Prophet because he spoke of tabernacling. That's the only reason why he was considered as a prophet. He did speak of the prophetic because the establishment of the vision is directly related with tabernacling. Daniel, however, after his day of work, it was usual for him to leave his place. Then he went to the river, and near the river then he used to rest, because he was truly a leader. And leaders, they have a situation in their lives that at times they have to be alone. There is not a company in the world that can comfort other than reading the instructions and having some divine link. Reading the instruction, reading the prophets, reading the Torah. And Moses was this kind of a person, Joshua was this kind of a person, Daniel was this kind of a person, Ezekiel was this kind of a person. And then when Daniel was resting near the river because of his day that was very busy, then he had visions from heaven. Moses, when he was tending his flock, then an animal got out of it and went astray. Moses had his ways of tending to his animals, and then he had to secure the existing animals he had and go after the animal that went astray. As he was on his way of finding these lost animals, down the mountain, top of the mountain, he couldn't find it. He was then very tired. Then he lay down to rest for a while. Thus then he saw the burning bush. So then when we read the Torah, when we read the Bible, we must always remove mysticism from the instructions and consider it as only facts. There are people around the world who are teaching that the 1,000 years of the Messiah is yet to come. It is a pure lie from the pit of hell. It truly is. There are so many people in this world teaching so much junk and deviating so many people. And then when we read the instructions, we always must remove mysticism out of the way. So then, Moses was resting and he saw the burning bush. So Daniel was a prophet and Moses was a prophet. Now, Moses had visions and understandings while he was then resting, known as dreams. He had dreams with instructions. So did Daniel. As Moses was resting, he saw then this wonderful and startling vision of a bush that was not burned. It had fire in it and it was not consumed. Well, of course, if you have dreams, sometimes you have situations in your dreams that doesn't make any sense, does it? Such as you light up a fire in the base of a dry bush and it doesn't burn. Then during his time of dream, then he saw himself before these, and he was then questioning himself regarding this situation. And the voice then obviously spoke with him and said, remove your sandals because you are then on holy ground. Then the mighty Creator decided of speaking with him and gave him some instructions, some understanding of what was going on, and the people there was then in Egypt, and they were there for more than 400 years. And then it was a time then to set these people at liberty from this awful place that was then the slavery in Egypt. Then Moses said, can't do it, because he was not confident enough in himself that he was able then to set the nation at liberty. And then the Creator retorted and said, but you must do this duty. And then Moses retorted, no, can't do it. Firstly, because Moses had military authority when he was then the influential person of Egypt, and he did understand the implications of being involved with murder in the military. If you are never in the military, you won't ever understand it. But the penalties in the military, they are very severe. Moses then was absolutely afraid of going back to Egypt. And then the Creator was frustrated, as a person would become frustrated with speaking with a person and giving some details and understandings and then giving some instructions, and obviously he was upset. And then the Creator decided of including the brother of Moses in the midst of it. And he said, as you go on your way, then your brother Aaron was then during this time, is going to be visiting with you, and then he was going to mention of the situation, giving him a certainty of the hot lot. So he went. They visited, and they did understand they were involved with a divine nature of understanding. So then, the situation is, were there 10 plagues? Egypt was never given the chance of learning the holy instructions because they did not exist. Now let me ask you this. Would the Creator be involved with a situation where he was not giving any instructions and destroying an entire nation because they were doing what they should not be doing, though they had no understanding of what they were doing. Would you destroy a nation without giving instructions? So the 10 plagues did not exist. In real life, they did not exist. And let's explain why. Because Aaron had some prior influence in Egypt. Aaron was able to find a way of having Moses before the presence of the Pharaoh. So then the development was Moses went with Aaron, went before Pharaoh, and he was explaining the situation. And then he asked if he would let his people go out of Egypt to serve then the living God. Pharaoh said no. Then Moses gave the first plague as a dream. Try to understand, Egypt during those times, they were absolutely serious regarding dreams, visions, and whatsoever you name, as far as understandings from heaven of what they understand as far as heaven. And they used to have manuals or recordings of dreams, and there were thousands of interpreters and priests and you name it. So dreams were extremely important during the time of Egypt. So then, first was then the situation regarding the water. The second then was then frogs and lice and then fleas and then pestilence and boils and hail and locusts. And then the place became dark and the slaying of the firstborn. Each of these had not taken place in the physical world. Now, over the centuries, because of the oral traditions and because of elders, they want to become in a place of influence, they used to always add something else than to attract the attention of the people, in order to become more, what's the word? Sensational. Thus they began to add situations that simply did not exist. And in today's society, because we don't understand the way Egypt was many centuries ago, then we tend to believe these junk that was told centuries and centuries and centuries ago. Now let me give another example. Goliath, for instance, from the city of Gath. The description in Samuel portrays a giant with the kind of armor the Hebrews did not have, and neither the Philistines. They had swords, they had spears, but if you read the description of Goliath, you find that this armor he was using was from the Greeks. Because the nation then was placed into captivity. Then they began to talk of their God and their influence, yet they were combining with the culture of the surrounding area where they were taken captive. Daniel, for instance, as he was resting near the river, then he had those understandings. So the same way with every other prophet. You know, the Creator, they don't destroy nations without giving them clear instructions. Then, as Pharaoh decided not to let the people go, then Moses said that the water is going to be turned into dam or blood. And then Pharaoh simply dismissed him. And then the very night, then he had the dream of the entire water supply of Egypt turned into blood. He was terrified. Now, we don't give value to our dreams. At least most of the people don't give any value to what they dream of. But back in Egypt, it was trivial and very important, recording dreams and then interpreting them. And the dream of Pharaoh, or the vision he had during his dream, was so real. He felt the solidness of the dream, and then the next morning he was absolutely terrified. And obviously he talked to his seers and his diviners, and they could not give to him a straight answer. So he had then Moses summoned, and Moses very humbly came before his presence, because we always should be circumspect during authority, and when before we are then before authorities, we should be very circumspect, and certainly Moses was. He was very respectful. And then Pharaoh was then questioning him. And Moses then did not give any kind of explanation. He simply wanted to let the people go. And Pharaoh said no. So then the very night he said no, then Moses said, this very night you're going to have this kind of a dream with the frogs. Thus then, during the night, then Moses had the dream regarding the frogs. And thus he was then questioning what was going on, because he had recorded what was going on, and he talked to his seers and then his diviners, and obviously they had no answers for him, and he summoned then again Moses. And so it was until the 10th plague. So then, when we begin our quest understanding each of these, then later on we do understand how Pharaoh was able of gathering an army and going after the Hebrews in the desert. You don't round up an army after the nation is destroyed. Similar situation is when the Hebrews were then walking on the desert for 40 years and the sandals of their feet were never worn out. But they never searched enough of going in the desert over there and finding then the symbols of the sandals that were then chiseled on rocks. Obviously, through the generations and years, it won't ever wear away, would they? So then, liars are everywhere. But then it's our quest of reading and understanding and debating and finding the answers. And mysticism should be left outside, as far as we can understand of our minds. Next time we're going to talk of Daniel. And then later on the life of the Messiah, because it has the same line of Moses, or very similarly, as far as what the Messiah did and what Moses was saying, and then Daniel the prophet. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.